It's really, really wonderful to welcome you to this event for a Flotilla for Change. My name is Eleanor Openshaw. I'm working with Flotilla for Change. As you know, Flotilla for Change is an initiative to shine light on the importance of sustainable travel, but also to act in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and other environmental activists who are working on all of our behalves to protect the planet and to fight for climate justice. This event today has been part of a series of events that Flotilla for Change has been organizing. They are events of solidarity with activists. And today's event is going to focus on how you tell the story of the impact of climate change, of the resistance and mobilization of communities at the forefront of climate change, and how you tell the story of the fight for climate justice. And telling that story will include how you tell the story in spaces where policy making that relates to the environment is being deliberated, discussed, and where decisions are being taken. And we hope that that's going to be interesting, of course, given the upcoming COP30 kicking off in November. Today, we're focusing on the Pacific Islands, where, of course, climate change is now a matter of survival for communities of the islands. We are incredibly lucky to have two speakers with us today, Pacific Islanders who are rich in experience. I have seen one of these speakers, John, talk about his role as being in the planet saving business, which I really like. And I'd love to just speak very briefly just to introduce the two of you, and then over to you, of course, John Taukave, who we're calling JJ, just for short, to be able to distinguish. John Kautoke, who we're calling JK, which I understand you call yourselves to distinguish the two Johns today. So let me just introduce you very briefly to the group. John Taukave is an activist, academic, artist. You've worked advocating for the preservation of Pacific heritage and Indigenous cultures and traditions. You've been working with the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport, and supported delegations at the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. Welcome to the conversation. And John Kautoke, an advisor on issues related to maritime greenhouse emissions. John, I also understand that you also work for the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport. I'm guessing the two of you met there, but maybe not. You can tell us. You've also been working for the Kingdom of Tonga on issues related to greenhouse gas emissions produced by the shipping industry. We're looking forward to hearing much more about all of those experiences that you have, what motivates you to do the work you have, and maybe also how you keep hopeful. Let me just wrap here before I pass over to the two of you to tell everybody that this event is being recorded. So if for whatever reason, you don't, that isn't appropriate for you, just to bear that in mind. We'll be posting this event up on our YouTube channel, so there'll be a chance to share it with friends and colleagues who may not be able to make it today. And of course, there'll be time at the end of the event for a little conversation, for questions and answers. To the two of you, Johns, thank you again for being here. We're really, really excited to hear what you have to share, and over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Eleanor. Nga toko no e mori, o toase le John Taukave, ma ngofanios o mo te Rotuma e Fiji. Tape ma ngoma o te sisiante, John, you leo me sa hanwe te Tonga, ma o te misuhunga hoise mai ofa la isla pola leo me te rangi te I, la isla Hoifengang, ma La ke loke o to misang whakanua. Eleanor and the Flotilla for Change team, thank you so much on behalf of the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport and on behalf of our Pacific communities as well for having us come on this platform and share the story of Oceania at the International Maritime Organization. It is a great opportunity for us to continue on telling the story and also, you know, getting the outreach there about the important work that the Oceania countries are doing at the International Maritime Organization. So we are very grateful. Again, my name is John Taukave. I come from the island of Rotuma in Fiji, and my brother John Kautoke comes from the Kingdom of Tonga. And we are both researchers and advisors for the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport in providing technical support and culture protocols at the International Maritime Organizations. So when we come to the IMO, we make sure that we uphold our identity and the story. And so first, you know, before we go into this sharing, I'm going to have a little bit of interacting with our audience. I know we have Philip, Dom, Eleanor, and I see one, Rawar. Please forgive me if I've mispronounced your name.
It's Ruth.
Okay.
Hello.
Ruth, welcome. And Matthias. So we're going to do a little bit of interacting. So first, before we continue, I want all of us to take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Oh, that's awesome. And to have a little bit of virtual participation, if you can put a high five or a thumbs up on your screen so we know you're with us. Oh, that's awesome. Yes. Oh, cool. And so in Rotuma, where I come from, Rotuma is an island in Fiji, the north of Fiji. Takes you about 3 days by ship to get there, or a 2-hour flight. And so in Rotuma, when we share stories, or we call it hanuchu, we always start off with our elders saying hanuch, and all of our little and all of the little cousins and the kids will say ma. And so one more activity for us is I'm going to start out by saying hanuch, and then everyone will say ma, and then I will start the story. And so we're gonna go hanuch.
Ma.
Hanuch okia rong on Holomui kimua ma 6-pack e IMO. All right, welcome everybody. Okay, let me see if I can. All right, and so to tell the story of the IMO at the IMO, the 6-pack or the Pacific at the IMO, here's a little bit of overview of our sharing today. So we start off with an introduction of the IMO. What is the IMO and what does it do? And then in that space of talking about the IMO, we're going to also weave in the story of our oceanic countries within the IMO. And so we'll be looking at oceanic solutions for a transition, which is a decarbonization transition, or we also call it Holomui Kimua. Holomui Kimua is, my brother will talk about it, is almost a Tongan philosophy, which means looking back into the future, acknowledging the past for us to move forward together. And so the origins of Holomui Kimua and the Pacific, we also look at oceanic ways of thinking, and we'll talk about a just and equitable transition in shipping, and providing a little bit of an oceanic lens on what this just and equitable transition means. And then finally, we will look at this concept of story living. Story living is sort of like a research methodology that I've applied into my research about living stories through different platforms, through the platform of arts. And so story living ceremony, story living practice, and story living performance. And so looking at these methods and how does it enable a Pacific or an oceanic presence at the IMO. And then finally, we will move to this concept we call talanoa, which is also a story living practice. And we'll be going back and forth with our audience on any questions or comments and having this free-flowing, fluid dialogue, just like the ocean. I hope that sounds good with everyone. Awesome. Okay, and now I'm going to hand it over to my brother, John Kautoke, or JK, to begin us off with the IMO, and we move forward from there. Foexia malo au pito.
And thank you, John T. I'm John K. Just don't confuse the both of us. People confuse us all the time. So. And I think, yeah, it's very pertinent what you said. In trying to maintain our identity as Pacific and Oceanic peoples, our culture and our heritage was also being part of a negotiation which is, defined by Western norms and how decisions are made, ideas like consensus and majority voting, all these things that conflict sometimes with our idea of how decisions should be made, the idea of listening in Talanoa, and the idea that all voices should be heard in these fora. I think it's been very difficult for us as Pacific peoples to be in these very rigid, very Western spaces, and to try to maintain our identities throughout these negotiations is very important for us. And so this is our way of telling the story, our negotiating, how we negotiate, what our positions are, and what is the basis for those positions, and why these negotiations at the IMO are really, really important for our countries, but also for the entire world and all indigenous communities, because they're heavily reliant on international shipping. So I'll just start. This is quite heavy compared to our early introduction, so I'll just try to go through it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. For those of you who are not aware or haven't heard of the IMO, it's one of the organizations within the United Nations. It's a specialized agency. It's one of only two specialized agencies which can then produce binding regulations which are enforced by its member states. And that word is important, binding regulations. So the IMO regulates international shipping, all of its activities, and they like to talk about the fact that international shipping carries 80% of global trade, and they like to talk about the fact that it's vital for the global economy. And we'll hear that often throughout all of our discussions, how it's very important for the global economy. And I think what was needed, firstly, at those negotiations was to try to humanize the discussions. Because the first thing that was missing is the idea that there are communities that are in far-flung regions. There are also indigenous communities in the Pacific that rely heavily on international shipping for their existence at this point. And that's just the way that the global economy has developed. And this is where we are at the moment. So the International Maritime Organization, as this global regulator, this UN specialized agency located in London, which was the heart of the British Empire. When we think about shipping, we think about it's the role that it's played in past injustices, such as the slave trade. And we also think about, one thing we rarely think about, people who are not versed in shipping, is the emissions that shipping contributes in a global scale. And they like to talk about the fact that it's 3% of all anthropogenic emissions per year, which I think sometimes is an attempt to try to minimize that contribution, but we know as Pacific peoples who are vulnerable to climate change, who see the effects of climate change every day, that every contribution to emissions contributes to the same climate damage. Emissions don't have boundaries. And the way that the UN system has decided to address these emissions is you have the ones for the countries, and then there's the sectors which are left for international shipping and aviation to do their own things to decarbonize. But we know that there's no other way the world works. The same emissions contribute to the same climate change damage, and we all feel those, especially the most vulnerable. And so that's why the IMO has taken account of its contribution of the international shipping to climate change. And at various times in the past 20 years, it's attempted to try to address that contribution. In many ways, it was not very meaningful, but finally in 2017, there was a decision put forward by its assembly, which is the highest a decision-making organ of the IMO, and that decision and direction was for the organization to respond to climate change. And this would be the first concrete action that it would take since the Kyoto Protocol, when it started to try to explore ways in which it would try to limit and then eliminate its emissions. So in compliance with that direction, the IMO and its member states agreed international shipping must decarbonize. And so there was a initial strategy which was put together in 2018. And this is the first point where we see some of our Pacific islands and our voices starting to appear in this discussion. And of course, in 2023, John, as you know, you were there.
Yeah.
The IMO also revised its strategy, GHG strategy, and the Pacific also played a major role in increasing the overall ambition of the reduction targets to a point where actually you could keep that 1.5 alignment alive if we had more ambition, the more ambitious side of those reduction trajectories. And so the goal is for shipping now is to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And this has been a subject of decades of negotiations, with the Pacific voices mainly absent throughout those negotiations, and then arriving at the point where it is needed, because now you see the action starting to move forward on the adoption of the initial and then the revised strategy. And then now we're heading into a position where we might adopt a set of measures to decarbonize international shipping in October later this year. So the negotiations, as I mentioned, the negotiations on the GHG are extremely important for the Pacific. And those are for three broad reasons, which I list there. The first is climate change. And it's a very obvious and something that shouldn't be taken for granted, because the reason for the negotiations, climate change, is usually put aside when we're in the negotiating room, as you know, John.
Yeah.
A lot of the negotiations and the discussions at the IMO are very technical. They're related to fuels. They're related to the grams of carbon dioxide equivalent within fuels. And there's a real sense that you're losing the purpose of what you're trying to do, which is trying to push international shipping to reach net zero emissions. And so the Pacific has been the main voice in the room, reminding everyone that we're doing this because of climate change, not because we're running out of carbon-based fuels. Yeah. This is about climate change. And so we bring those stories about our vulnerabilities, about the struggles we face every year with all the cyclones, and then compounded by natural disasters within our regions. I mean, in 2022, my own house was destroyed by the tsunami, and then there's a sea level rise and the high tides and the low tides. So these are all real impacts for us all around the world, but also for a lot of indigenous communities.
The realities, eh?
And so you have to remind them every time that it's about climate change. This is why we're doing this. It's not just for the Pacific, but for the entire world. The other reason that these negotiations are really important is because of our reliance on shipping. So in terms of reliance on shipping, even though it's incredibly important for the functioning of the global economy, there are countries who rely on it more than others, and not just for the economy, but for survival. And those, we've heard at the IMO, groups like the Inuits, also heavily rely on international shipping, but also countries like ours, SIDS, which are very remote from their markets, which cannot produce the food required to sustain its populations in the islands. They need to import all of those. And so you see in places, 90% of the food imports, for example, in atoll nations, they're imported by ships. And almost all of the medical and critical supplies are imported by ships as well. And so you see there that the climate change and reliance on shipping, these negotiations are where our vulnerabilities intersect. And so that's why it's really important that our voices are heard in these discussions. I think the other thing that's dangerous and that is a real risk of happening is the risk of being left behind. Because the transition is going to move along whether we like it or not. Even countries who won't agree to it. It's going to have to move along. The IMO and its member states have agreed that shipping is to decarbonize. It's agreed that it needs to respond to climate change. And so that transition is going to move along like a steamroller. And those countries who are going to face the impacts, not just from the measures, but also don't have the opportunities that other countries have. Large countries, countries located on large routes, also those who have large companies. in our region, we don't have any of that. And so the solutions that would apply globally will not necessarily apply to our region. And part of that is, like, for example, the fuels that are required for the long-term transition. We have no opportunities to produce those fuels. And so that kind of trickles down into, from international shipping into national shipping and regional shipping as well, because they all use the same infrastructure at the end of the day. So the change is going to be transformative once it comes. And so you have to ensure that the countries who don't have the capacity or don't have the means or the opportunities aren't left behind. And the Pacific, I think I'm very proud to say, has been the main proponent of calling for countries not to be left behind. It's part of this idea of ensuring a just and equitable transition, which John will elaborate on further. But going back, so those three reasons are very key for us, and that's why the GSG negotiations at the IMO, even though they seem quite remote, are really important for our region. And all indigenous communities who rely on international shipping. But I think the other thing, going back to what I mentioned earlier about trying to maintain our indigenous identity within the IMO space, is trying to frame our solutions through the lens of our heritage and through the lens of our understanding of what needs to be done for our region, what's best for us in this transition. Next slide, please. And that's one thing next slide. The one thing I'd like to mention as well is at the IMO, the same voices in other fora are not necessarily the ones that are valued or have the most weight. And as we know, it regulates a sector that is important to the global economy, and there's very heavy economic interests in the decision making at the IMO. And so there's a lot of private sector actors who are also present within the IMO, partly also because they want to they have an interest in the decision making, but also because much of the expertise, the technical expertise, lies with the private sector. So they're in those rooms during decision making points, they're in the corridors for lobbying. One thing that was quite surprising for the Pacific when we arrived at the IMO was the fact that there were very few Pacific Islanders sitting behind Pacific Island seats. And that's something that maybe I think you'll talk about more, but one of the key leaders in our work here, Ambassador Albany Shota, and also the former president of Marshall Islands, Tony de Broom, that's something that they realized when they entered the room. There were no Pacific Islanders sitting behind Pacific flags at the IMO, which is very shocking for a UN agency. But that goes back to how the IMO is set up and the interests, the commercial interests, which are behind a lot of the players within this particular forum. And so there's a clear initiative that we have to make sure that there are indigenous Pacific peoples in the room who experience the day-to-day hardships of reliance on international shipping, but also climate change. They have to be in the room if they want to get the messaging across effectively. That's the only way that you'll be able to get it across, if you have people who live that reality every day. And part of that was empowering the Pacific countries to take back their seats at the IMO. As I mentioned, there's a lot of players with economic interests, and one of those key players are shipping registries. You've heard a lot about shipping registries. The Pacific has a few shipping registries, the largest of which is Marshall Islands. And I think Marshall Islands right now is probably the largest, or the third largest shipping registry in the world. And so they have quite an influence because of that role that they play in international shipping. And so that's how it also differs from other fora, right? Because in other fora, political and economic power usually gives you the influence you need. But at the IMO, it's the size of your fleet and it's the total tonnage of your fleet that gives you the influence that you need. And so it was also about capitalizing on Marshall Islands' influence to empower the Pacific countries to be in those negotiations, to be in those rooms, and to make decisions which are good for their country. And nowhere was this needed the most than in the negotiations to decarbonize international shipping at the IMO. Next slide, please. And so this is where we start our first framing of, the decarbonization. what we need from our region, and what we as indigenous, as Pacific peoples see as the solutions that we need for our region, and that the International Maritime Organization and its member states need to listen to if we were going to get that transition, the just and equitable transition we talked about. So I think very key to that is this concept of Holomui Mua. Holomui Mua in Tongan means to walk forward or looking back. So when you look back at and you learn lessons from the past and you apply that to solutions in the future. And I think that concept first came about in 2013. I think it was the Tongan Research Association theme for the conference they had.
Yeah.
And in that conference, they asked the researchers to use their heritage and use their indigenous heritage and their past and their culture to aid them in finding solutions for the future. Very often, technology is very enticing. There's very technical advances in technology, but Holomui Mua tells us that we have to also respect the past and respect the ways that they used, the traveling, the wayfinding. And so that's why for the Pacific, we already have those experiences of traveling on sustainable transport, using the wind only with no instruments to navigate the vast Pacific. We had those vessels. They were sustainable. Our people knew how to maintain them. They knew how to use them. And most importantly for us, it gave us power, but it also empowered us as indigenous peoples, because using those ships, we could travel the oceans freely. We could mend our sails wherever we were, because those products were available wherever they were. And we knew how to make the vessels. And it's unfortunate now because with the advent of fossil fuel powered transport in the Pacific for ships, those practices have died out. And there has been a lot of attempts to try to reinvigorate or revive those practices, because we know in our hearts that those are the practices which are sustainable for the Pacific, and those are the solutions we need. We need to Holomui Mua. We need to learn from our past and use those applied into the future. And so this is where we need to tell that story to the IMO and let them know that their solutions might not necessarily apply to a region like ours.
Yeah.
We have a past rich in maritime navigation, and this is where we need to look to, what we look for solutions for our countries. And that leads into one of the projects that we worked on at the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport, securing a vessel for the Marshall Islands, which is called the Juranai. And it's these type of initiatives that we need to, that the IMO needs to see are the solutions that we need for our region in order for us to be part of the energy transition of shipping and contribute to the overall goal of reaching a just and equitable transition. And so I'll just hand it over to John to take you through that, the Vaka, the ship, the Juranai, all the initiatives. Thank you, John.
Malo, thank you very much for laying the foundations and, for starting that weave of this story. It's so interesting. And, in the Pacific, with a history of millennia of voyaging and navigating the world's largest vast ocean, and to keep that inspired past with us, but to also keep us grounded in moving forward, is something that was very enlightening, especially when I first came in. And as you see in this slide, there's a picture of the Juranai, and I believe it's like one of the first of its kind in the Pacific, where we've started to apply those back into the region, where this vessel is a wind vessel that operates mainly on wind. It's 80% carbon efficient as well. And I was very humbled to be part of the whole process of when this was constructed. And this vessel was constructed in South Korea, in Busan, and to go there and see firsthand the application of cultural methods, the wind, as that new energy was very much inspiring, and also could pave the way or set an example for the rest of our Pacific fleet to properly transition, making sure that we're not left behind, you know. And so again, you know, the ancestral knowledge around the vaka or the wa'a or the va'a or the tafanga, or in the many ways we call this symbol. This symbol is also central to our identity when we enter spaces like the IMO. And using that inspiration to go in and make sure that when we negotiate on our terms, from our lenses, upholding our cultures and our identities. And the Juranai is just one example of the ways that we have been trying to apply this Holomui Kimua at the IMO. Let me go next. Now, you mentioned, you know, we talked about this just and equitable transition. So again, you know, in the strategy, at the IMO strategy, the shipping has to decarbonize by or around 2050. Yeah? And so when we first came into this, making sure that our countries were not left behind, we came up with this just and equitable transition, you know, making sure that we are part of the processes, and we have to make sure that, you know, it was 1.5 aligned, you know, working with the Paris Agreement, but also to make sure that we were part of those negotiations and we were part of those discussions, and at the same time making sure that the whole process or these procedures at the IMO was fair, and it was fair for us. And so we introduced that in order to decarbonize the shipping, international shipping, we introduced this universal flat levy on all GHG emissions, you know, when we did that submission. So in our submission to the intersessional working group of GHG emissions, ISWG GHG 1425, that was the name of our submission. We talk about what a just and equitable transition means. And so for me, as a Pacific, you know, as a Pacific Islander, when I first come into this IMO space, I'm trying to think how or where or how do I envision this in a way. And so the first thing that I thought of, just like Holomui Kimua, was the practice of weaving. And so I look at this as story living. And so story living for me is a concept that I thought was a way to live our stories through, you know, in different scenarios or different situations, especially at the IMO. And so living our stories. So how can we live our stories? One of those ways in which we live our stories is through the practice of weaving, the weaving of pandanus leaves, you know, to weave these finely woven mats. One of our scholars, Vilsoni Heriniko, he calls these woven mats woven gods, because the process of weaving these fine mats was in a way imbuing the mana or the power into these strands to make sure that these were actual, you know, like these were gods on these mats. And that's how sacred they became. They were symbols of, and we applied them in ceremonies when during funerals or during marriage or even on our vakas. So we'd weave these mats on our sails that guided us. And so that's an added example of Holomui Kimua, because we're applying the weaving, not the vaka, but on our sails to help us navigate. And so when I looked at what a just and equitable transition means, in the submission, I tried to weave in everything together. And so in the submission, it says, in order for this transition, this decarbonized transition in maritime shipping, in order for it to be just and equitable, the trend, so these, I looked at 3 strands on one side and one, you know, the warp and the waft, to make sure they all weave together. So I called it this just finely woven, just and equitable transition mat. And so the first one goes, the transition should be procedurally fair. That's what we talked about in the submission, making sure that we were part of all those discussions. The second one is the transition should be equitable in relation to maritime mitigation, making sure that the impacts of the GHG emissions from ships are mitigated. And then also making sure that the transition should be equitable in responding to the climate impacts that we currently face, and it's a reality for us. So those were three that I looked up. But then at the same time, in order for them to weave and, you know, to hold together, the just and equitable transition, I call it a jet. The jet must also align again with the Paris Agreement in aligning with no more than 1.5 temperature, you know, degrees. And so when we weave all of these concepts together, that was how I saw a just and equitable transition, how we can make sure that we're not left behind, that the Oceania countries are not, and to picture it as a mat. And you know, we talk to Pacific negotiators as well, but if we want to explain this to our communities, you know, to our kids, to explain it in a way that they can understand. And I thought the map was a great example of how to communicate that back to our communities, you know?
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I think the concept of a mat is very good because they all have to be achieved. The whole system was a package together. And so just like weaving, if one of the fronds is loose, the whole mat begins to unravel. And so you had to achieve all of those elements of those fronts, as you say. And so the package comes as a whole, and one front cannot be left out over another. They need to be woven together, and that's just an equitable transition. I think one of the things that we were quite disappointed about coming out of the last negotiation was the fact that we had managed to get just an equitable transition into the 2023 strategy. And that was a strong push by the Pacific to ensure that the requirement to achieve, contribute to a just and equitable transition was in the strategy. There was also a push to increase the interim checkpoints to the strive targets, which is what we need to achieve. And also the addition of the 1.5 degrees target into the strategy. Those were all achievements. And the strategy was meant to be the document that would guide what we need to achieve going forward.
Moving forward.
We were successful in getting almost all of our elements in the requirements of just an equitable transition. And it was quite disappointing for us at the last session that that mat began to unravel because of the global situation with the United States and because of countries going back on their promises, which they made in the strategy, that they need to achieve these targets, they need to contribute to
It's like a prolonging, delaying tactic. And now, which brings me to another one. When there have been moments where we have felt that our voices were not heard, or we were even ignored in those, you know, critical discussions. And so, for me, when I looked at these moments of struggle and disappointment, I thought about story living in the sense of performance and how could we voice our disappointment. And one of them was, you know, I first came in 2022 into the IMO, and when I heard about all of these deliberations that were going on and how we were constantly being let down, I urged a moment to activate the space at the IMO, a challenge. And so I used living our stories through this medium of performance in a challenge. And I performed a Rotuman key. And so a Rotuman key is almost like a challenge or a chant before going into battle. And it was a way of challenging everyone in that plenary, including the chair of both MPC and ISLG, the chairs and everyone in that room, including states and the NGOs and civil society, in order to challenge them, but bringing, like you said, a humanity and a spiritual presence of why we are at the IMO, you know? And so I used that as a way of, one, gaining the attention to say and to let everyone know in that room that we are here. We are here and we're challenging everyone here that this challenge of climate change is an existential crisis for us. And we're challenging everyone in the room to work together. And so I was reading a little bit, and then this guy, Gilles Deleuze, who's a philosopher, he talks about this theater and performance he calls it a major in the minor, meaning transforming these major, these established structures and languages into minor keys. But minor keys is not saying that it's minor. Minor keys is bringing that humanity and that spiritual presence within spaces for people to actually listen. And so I used that. So it became story living the major, the IMO structure, in a minor key, which is the Rotuman key as well, which was, and then I would love to share with you all that key, because I think it was a powerful presence. And, it's going to be different as how, if I was live and all of us here were looking and in the same space, but I want to put it out there virtually for you to get a feel of what this actually meant for the Pacific. And for Oceania, and it starts off. You have to give me some space.
Give you some space.
Not too much. So it goes like, again, the concept of the key is a story about a Rotuman warrior called Fe'efe, and how he used the key which was composed by an elder from Rotuma by the name of Ngangach Tamanav. And it was interesting to note that the connection between men or between the people and nature, how that connection was so strong and it thrived at that time, and in some way that has disconnected today. And so I wanted to share this key, and he performs it, and it's in relation to almost like ants, and how ants come together and how they can challenge. But again, they're coming together, and when they come together, they form this solid, this solid colony of ants, and that they can fight anything. And so there's a bit of comparison into that, and it goes like this: Opopom, Okofaro, hi tuahi, tu e maro atae, finglele manata volhitihe, ya. Tui, toko e muri, rau ata, fu vaka, ne oki, futo no I, vata, seine vaka, to ai, hi tuahi, to ai, tuturu e po. Fuokilamu uhapasa sanga o via on sanga sasapse on la tamate okya motara la pa e papatoa tamate e ai hi tuahi yopakora all right. I have no idea what happened to the slides.
Just to give you more space because you asked for it.
Oh, okay. Are we able to go back to the slide?
I think it's share screen again.
Okay.
Click share screen. Yeah. And share screen.
Okay. Hold on. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Okay. And now this is story living performance. So we have story living practice, which is weaving, story living performance in the major, in a minor key, and the final story living I thought of or reflected on and applied was story living ceremony. So ceremony in a way where we live our stories through different ceremonies. Yeah? And so the first that I wanted to, the first of those ceremonies was one, Talanoa. So Talanoa in Oceania is a way of having open and fluid dialogue openly, and to include everyone in that dialogue. And usually when we carry out Talanoa, we usually have a drink that is prepared as well, which is called kava. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with kava, or those of you who love or drink this kava, especially Brother Pete, I see you, brother. Kava is the root of the kava plant. The scientific name is piper. It's like a pepper plant. Pepper methysticum, that's the name. And so we harvest the root of this plant, we dry it, and then we pound it into a powder and we mix it with water on these wooden ceremonial bowls called tanoa. And usually when we carry out these talanoa, this kava session, because there's protocols as well, we participate in talanoa, which is having this open, fluid dialogue back and forth, but also respecting everyone's presence in that space. And so, we do this on different levels, whether it's at home, whether it's for the community, or whether it's national or regional. This ceremony, in a way, brings our communities together to have dialogue. And we've applied it on many different species. Like, it could be me and my uncle back at home after a day at the plantation of fishing, we come and we mix and we talanoa at home. Or it can be when two villages are having disputes over each other, they come into a space to have this dialogue, and usually the kava facilitates that dialogue. And it could be even on the international level. We have used this concept of talanoa at the UN, FCCC, at the COPs. We've made it a way of having these conversations. And so for us, this is a way of us living ceremony. And we've also applied this story living ceremony at the IMO, and it's come with great success. We have had talanoa and cover sessions in London, bringing the mat, the woven mat again, where everyone's seated, and we brief, our negotiators brief, but also we have things like webinars or talanoa sessions where negotiators, civil societies, and even our ministers, we all come together and we talk and we have this dialogue about what's happening at the IMO, and people can voice their frustrations or voice their happiness about what's going on. But the main thing about this is it builds trust among everyone. And so it's led to such where we've built this coalition, and I think talanoa and kava has been a big part of building these nurtured relationships, because as in the Pacific, relationships are really key, And so we've built this not with Oceania, but we've built coalitions with other regions, like the Caribbeans come in, some African states have come in, Latin America. And so this process of talanoa has brought, like-minded, states that suffer the same impacts of climate together to form a coalition to make sure that, the SIDS, the LDCs, and our voices are not. And we also help each other by co-sponsoring submissions, which helps in the discussions.
Yeah, those are countries that are already marginalized in the negotiations.
Yes, absolutely.
And who had, until this point, remained silent on a lot of the GHG negotiation issue. I think partly because they didn't have the technical expertise to understand the technical details, but also because they didn't want to, it's very difficult to speak out when you're a lone voice in a room. So you have to come together somehow.
Yeah. And that was story living ceremony through kava and talanoa. And so now to round us off back, to again, the story is not done. The story is constantly evolving with every meeting that we go to. And to know that a legacy, that there is this legacy of presence and fighting for our realities, for our communities in this space, is very encouraging and empowering. And for us to end this little sharing, I bring us back to, this, he's like a founding father for Pacific empowerment and oceanic empowerment. And his name, the late Dr. Epeli Hauofa, and he's from Tonga too. And so he reminds us that when we go into spaces, he reminds us that the ocean, one, is vast, that we should not be characterized by the smallness of our islands, but by the vastness of our great ocean. And, not only applying that in terms of geographically, but I think a key point that he raised was the psychological impact of making sure that we uphold that us as Pacific people, we're not defined by smallness, and that sometimes too can impact the way we think when we're going into spaces, especially like the IMO. And so he says we should not be defined by the smallness of our islands, but by the greatness of our oceans. He says Oceania is vast, Oceania is expanding, it is hospitable and generous, rising from the depths of brine in regions of fire deeper still, and Oceania is us. And a way I've always held like people like Epeli Haofa, the late Epeli Haofa, Tony de Broom, Ambassador Ishoda, even Brother Pete as well, you know, making sure that, you know, they constantly inspire the next generation of young negotiators, just like you and I, and our team as well, to go into these spaces and to carry the humanity and the spirituality of who we are as indigenous peoples of Oceania, going into those spaces and defending our identities. And with that, that concludes our sharing today. And now we open for Talanoa with our audience here virtually with us in some Q&A. And again, we're open to any comments or questions you may have that we'd gladly love to share with you. And after our Talanoa, then I will formally end our session today. For Exia,
Malo.
Malo. Thank you.
Need to stop sharing.
Okay. Eleanor, back to you. If you have any.
No, not back to me at all. Listen, I mean, thank you at this point. Just, I feel we've traveled miles and miles in this in what you've covered. And I'm really hoping that people who've joined for the conversation are going to have comments and questions, as you say. So let's see.
Yeah. Awesome. Anyone have any questions or comments? Very much welcome to go back and forth.
Okay, I have one. I hope you didn't talk about this. In the meeting where you did the performance, what was that meeting about specifically, and like what was achieved? I hope you didn't cover this and I just didn't hear it, but yeah.
No, absolutely. Thank
Okay,
you
cool.
very much. Thank you very much. So this was in 2023 during the revised strategy, the meeting, and making sure that our voices were continuously heard, because there were moments where we were left out of negotiations, where there was only this select few of either states or industry stakeholders that would ultimately discuss the resolution on what, and we were not part of those. And so it was very discouraging to hear that. And you know, whenever we'd again Talanoa, you know, in our briefs with, you know, with our groups, we'd always voice these concerns. And so for me, manifesting all of these, I asked our ambassador Albany Shoda if at the end of that meeting, at the end of the week, if I could share a piece of not only the disappointment, but a challenge to everyone to make sure that we were all part of that. And so I did that challenge. And I scared a few people, but you know, it woke a lot of people up, even the chat.
I think the one of the purposes of the key was kind of a collective catharsis for the whole Pacific, because it was very frustrating during these 2 weeks. Like John said, we're not listened to a lot of the time, and we have to repeat the same point over and over again. And we've tried all the methods to try to get the chair to listen to us.
We did everything. We went the right way. Yeah.
Exactly. We played the game, and so the game doesn't work. So we have to come up with our own way of doing things. And so all that frustration is released when John does the key, and the challenge is put to the IMO Secretariat and to the Secretary General of the IMO negotiations to accept the challenge. You know, listen to us. We're the ones that are telling you what we need for this transition.
Yeah.
You just have to listen.
Yeah.
It's easy.
And it's almost become, you know, a way of us, and I think ever since then, we always, in a way, constantly repeat that challenge. So A lot, yeah.
Oh, the other question you asked was what was achieved in that meeting. So that was the revision of the
strategy,
2023
yeah.
strategy. And so that was revising the initial strategy, which had really weak targets. And I think the target was what, to reach to 50% emissions
50,
reductions by
50.
2050, which is very weak. It's not 1.5 aligned. And so in the end, you get reaching net zero, which is weaker than what we wanted. We wanted zero on a roll-to-wake basis. But you ended up with net zero by 2050, which is already much higher than what they had agreed to before in the initial strategy. And then you ended up, most importantly, with interim targets to reduce emissions. So that's between 2027, when the measures enter into force, in 2050. So in between that period, you have to reach a specific target. And that's very important for the 1.5 alignment, because it's the shape of the curve reductions that determines what's 1.5. And so that reduction by 2040 needs to be particularly steep. If you want to achieve between 2030 and 2040, it needs to be particularly steep to achieve the 1.5 reduction alignment. And that was possible when you take into account the incentivizations, when you take into account the need to achieve the strive targets, the higher end of those targets. Unfortunately, when you came to the negotiations in October, because of the current landscape and the political landscape, the US démarche, there are a lot of things that kind of went out the window. Countries not keeping to their original agreements, reach targets in what we have now basically it's kind of a contradiction. Because you have those targets need to meet, and you have something that might not achieve those targets.
And that didn't mean that we're not only voicing frustration, but in a way it was almost bringing our ancestors with us to that space, so that they, because I felt like when I performed it, it wasn't me who was performing. It was not my ancestors, but the ancestors of the whole Oceania that voiced out. And it also meant that we were not going to give up the fight, that we're always going to challenge and constantly fight for our communities. Thank you, Ruth, for that question.
Thank you. Yeah. One more. Did you say the same things in your performance just then, or was it different?
Yes.
It was the same.
So again, just like this natural comparison to ants, but also in a way of comparing before you go to battle, you are envisioning yourself as part of the hanua, or the environment, where I count it as, when you're in front, you make sure that your foundations, I say, tuturu e pofu okilamo, meaning your legs or your stances or your foundation. It can mean, like literally or metaphorically, that your legs are as grounded as the black rocks on the island. And so those having the strong foundations, but it also meant that we're coming there because we have these strong foundations and we know who we are. And so making sure that, and that was just one example, and then the ant, but also thanking our oceanic, counterparts in their united work in this constant battle, and all of that is recited within the chant. And it was very special because the chief that I worked with composed that chant specifically for that moment. And so I used that moment, to highlight a very moving moment for me, especially as well, and for our Oceania.
Thank you. Cheers.
Hey?
No, there's a question.
Oh, there's a question. Yes, Brother Dom.
I've got a more practical question. I'm a practical person. I think I know what the energy transition looks like with like land-based transport, electric cars, trains, that sort of thing. But getting shipping, maritime, thousands of big multi-thousand-pound, kilo boats, traveling around the world, getting them to zero is really hard. And I'm just wondering if you could say a couple of things about what the solution might look like, how we do that, and also what in this context, what the difference between zero and net zero is. Like with coal power stations, it might be, transitioning to and then planting some trees to make it net zero.
Yeah.
What would it look like in maritime world?
So this was part of what we talked about the fact that we needed a just and equitable transition. So the whole thing worked as a package together. And if you look into the IMO's revised strategy, there are 3 things that they say that the measures need to achieve. One of them was incentivizing the global fleet. What was the other one? Contributing to adjusting the level playing field, just and equitable transition. And the other one was, I forgot what it was.
Yeah.
Incentivize to provide the welfare and the incentive. The energy transition, something with the energy transition. Anyways, there's these 3 things. I'm sure Pete's really knocking himself. Yeah, he's explaining net zero. But so that was why our solution was based around this idea of a flat levy, is that it could achieve all those things whilst ensuring a rapid transition. And of course, there are disproportionate negative impacts which are created by any regulation when you have it at a global scale. And the IMO and the member states already took account of the fact that there are going to be negative impacts created by the regulation of international shipping and driving it towards the net zero target. And so the solution to that was to also use the revenues which are generated as a byproduct to offset or to address those disproportionate negative impacts, right? So the whole system works together. At the same time, you would have rewards to incentivize ships to move as quickly as possible. And I think the difficulty is having also the strict definition of which fuels need to be rewarded and incentivized. That's the really important thing, because much of the capital investments which needs to be made is made by the private sector. The IMO is only sending a signal. And so our idea was to have the most ambitious and have those technologies and solutions that are scalable and also a long-term and long run, and signal to the market very clearly that these are the things that we need. We need to incentivize wind. We need to incentivize fuels that are actually green fuels that produce no emissions, no CO2 equivalent emissions. And so the market would see that that's what we need to be going. So they'll put capital investments into that way. And then that would, when we get to the point where we need those infrastructure and those fuels and technologies, they would already be in place. But that was really contingent on having very clear signals, a very clear identification of the solutions that we need to be incentivizing for the long term.
Yeah.
And then that would drive the whole thing. And then for rewards, you would have the byproduct revenues coming in, because you want ships to move. It's a carrot and the stick approach again, where you have a really high price, which drives ships, pushes them to move. As a byproduct, there are revenues generated, which are used to address disproportionate negative impacts for countries, reward ships, and also create a clear signal in the meantime for the fleet. So the whole thing worked as a package. As John says, it's a mat. It's woven together. If one of those strands goes missing, then the whole thing begins to collapse. The whole thing begins to unravel. And so, unfortunately, what we have now on the table as an outcome of the recent negotiations at the IMO, those who know, is actually giving really unclear signals and really unambitious targets on the table right now. And so those signals are very confused. I think at the moment, there's an incentivization for LNG, some biofuels as well. But those targets haven't even been agreed yet, like beyond that point. So there's a lot of confusion for the private sector as well on what they should be doing. And we've heard stories of people who were taken on to help with the long-term incentivization who have now been kicked out because they're moving their investments somewhere else on those fuels. And so it's very unfortunate that this is where we are at the moment, but we don't lose hope. There are still things we can do.
Oh, sorry, David. Yes. Thank you.
Yes. Need to move it close. There we go. Is that better? Okay.
Hi, John and John. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. I came in a bit late, so hopefully I'm not asking the right thing. And I'm really tired, so my questions might be a bit rambly. Sorry.
It's okay.
I have so many questions. So I might just like fire a few at you and take your pick. There's questions around, are you guys going to COP? Is that like a thing that's happening, or maybe delegates that you know are going to COP, or have you been to past ones? And do you have demands? What would you like to see there? How can we support you, or Pacific Island states, you know, generally or particularly? And also, is there much involvement if you are going to COP? Are you aware of like the People Summit and what's happening with that, and LinkedIn? So yeah, take your pick. And I'm sure I have more questions, but we'll start with those.
Yeah, so
Are we going to COP?
yeah, there's always the question every year of whether we're going to go to COP or not, because it also happens concurrently with other meetings at the IMO that sometimes we're participating in. But I think our idea is that we would try to increase
Our
the
presence.
presence in COP, because right now, also partly thanks to the push which the Pacific has done, the IMO looks very good in the UNFCCC space, and so they're actually capitalizing on a lot of the work that we've done collectively. It makes them look good in that space.
And even at the old, I was present at the last COP in Baku, and it was also the SG for the IMO was there, and we had a team that was present at the COP as well. So we had different Talanoa sessions about maritime shipping and climate within those spaces at the COP as well. So we had those discussions, and I think that's a great way, on bridging those two spaces together,
Yeah, so we do know people who are going to COP, and there is a lot of support that's required. I think the technical side support is probably okay, but like stuff like Talanoas, those are very important, and it's very difficult, especially as negotiations are running, as people know, to get people together in a space where they can actually share in an open manner ways forward. And I know that's very difficult because a lot of the negotiations are huddles, and then they're also inside rooms, and then they go into late at night and they're in different places. So I think just trying to bring people together, and also a way to release that frustration. It's very difficult because you take that back home. You take that back home, and it also affects your mentality, the way that you work. So
and that's why they have the Pacific and Oceania Pavilion as well, where a lot of the Pacific have those discussions and those Talanoas and those about the negotiations, but also we also bring in a little bit of the shipping story within those Talanoas as well, just so that we're all part of the same fight as well. So we have teams in the UNFCCC, but we have also in the IMO and all other different spaces that we can come and share. And that's important, like having those things, because the negotiations can be really disheartening, and it's long, and they go till the early hours. And Pacific people need space for them to be themselves when they come together in those spaces.
I think in terms of demands, I think we have we have a couple of demands. The first is to actually come up with actually work towards a solution instead of hiding behind many excuses, which I know a lot of countries are doing at the moment. There's a lot of hiding behind excuses and making it look like they actually want to be part of the solution when it's not. I think I'd rather appreciate honesty than pretend. Honesty is what we need. If we're not going to do it, then let us at least know. And if you're going to do it, then work with us.
And it's really hard too, because when we invest so much in these discussions, and it really impacts us, especially when we go back. How do we tell our communities, that we failed to a certain extent? How do we explain it to the next generation, of them coming in, to try and inspire them? And so we try to make sure that we keep the story ongoing, and we talk about the fight. Sometimes it's hard to.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also support for the stuff that happens before COP in Bonn.
Oh yeah, just recently.
Actually, I think that's quite important as well, because
the build-up.
Some of our delegations don't get to go to those COPs as well, or to those sessions in Bonn.
Which comes because we don't, our delegations, we don't have the capacity to go to each and every one of these meetings. And if we do, it takes a lot of capital to send a team over, and to be there for that whole time.
And also, I think in terms of the IMO, decarbonizing international shipping, there's one, just talking about what we have right now. The IMO seems really proud as an organization of what it's achieved. But for us, we need to amplify what needs to be achieved, and if it can be achieved, to achieve the just and equitable transition we asked for.
Yeah.
So it's not just about what we have, but what we need to have to achieve what the Pacific has been calling for. So those messages need to be going out there regularly.
And just to clarify, we talk about the Pacific and the Oceania. It's almost both the same terms because we're referring to the ocean as well. And these, like the coalition we call the Six Pack Plus, is one of those big coalitions that we've built that has taken years to build, making sure that everyone, is on the same page when we go into these negotiations, but also to make those who are usually ignored or not heard of come together as a group together. Eleanor.
Can I ask? Yeah, Eleanor, go. If
Bruce,
I
go
have
ahead.
chimed
No,
in.
Karina, go ahead. Go ahead.
There's this, I think there's a lot of people, I'm based in the UK, and there's a lot of people who maybe kind of think it's all, I don't know, the easiest word is like, is a bit bullshit, all of the negotiations, and it's talking and you have to really like stay calm, or you show your frustrations through this performance and you find these creative ways. But a lot of people who I now know are just kind of doing stuff in an alternative sense, like putting solar panels on their houses and like reforesting the land that they can, and doing all these other like practical things whilst the negotiations are going on. Do you find, is that something that's happening where you are as well? Is there like this, is there a need for transition, or is it that maybe where you are in your culture and the society around you, it's like, well, no, we're all living pretty like environmentally friendly lives, whereas in the UK I think a lot of us aren't living very environmentally friendly lives, and we're like, okay, how do we make these changes ourselves if the government isn't going to make those changes?
Should I start? Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, and of course I think many personal changes lead to big global changes.
Yeah.
And so we need to encourage people to make those changes. But in the Pacific, we don't like to be hypocrites when we go to these stages. So we're also implementing our own national plans for decarbonization. I mean, even though you could argue we don't need to, but all emissions contribute. But because we're net sinks as well. But the thing is that we're also going out of our way to also try to make our economies reach zero. Do our part. And stuff like the Juran-I. The Juran-I, as an example, we're trying not to be hypocrites. So we've set the example by seeking funding and constructing a vessel to show it's possible for the world, that it's possible to do this. The money is out there. It's not an issue of money. It's just an issue of action. And I think in terms of, there was a very good point that you were talking about as well, but it's kind of lost on me. I've lost my train of thought.
No, yeah.
But I think, I think you're right. In that sense, there are a lot of people who are frustrated with the multilateral forum. Multilateralism is kind of probably its weakest points it's ever been at this moment. But it's frustrated a lot of people because they don't see any concrete changes coming out of these negotiations. And we understand that frustration. I mean, we've been the ones calling for real change. And it's about having that real change and adopting something and actually working on, getting concrete changes out there And I think part of that is getting the messaging out that you're going to do this at this point, and you're going to have this done by that point and enter into force. All these concrete things need to be out there. But unfortunately, at the IMO, the media, like the media output for the work that they're doing is very limited. And I think it shows up on the news, BBC once, and it disappears into nowhere. So I think part of the accountability which the transparency gives is kind of lost on that as well. So and when the failure happens, it's not doesn't make people feel as bad about the failure as it should be.
And that's where we come in, where we, spaces like this webinar that we're having, or we go to conferences and we put out articles, or we do webinar talanoas with our region as well, just to make sure that we continue the story and it doesn't get just forgotten after one meeting and everyone forgets about it. We constantly try to outreach, and this is an example of it, that we're talking about it, and that's a big thing for us. We have a question from Brother David. Yeah, bro. Sorry, I hope that answers your question, Karina, but we can come back to you. But David,
Yeah. So it's the same like John. It's not very funny question. Very practical.
We can't hear you properly.
It's better now.
Okay, yeah.
Kind of,
Yeah. Is it okay now? Now?
Perfect.
Okay. We had a meeting with Zesta Zero Emission Transportation, and I also know from Bonn, the main topic is going to be just transition. So it's quite amazing because it's opening. Before it was just about climate change, and now they are talking about just transition. And indigenous people want to have just an ethical transition, and it was removed. They don't want it to be ethical because then you have to tweet about extraction, manual extraction, and you have to. Okay, so jet. I don't think jet's going to go through. It's going to be just GT, just GT. So my question is, because it's not going to be the main topic of the COP, of this COP, the main focus, the main negotiation is going to be about a just transition. And it was put forward by the women and association and worker association. And unfortunately, indigenous people was not heard because they want ethical transition. So how can we promote? My first question is going to be a bit like Karina said. How can we promote in a side event or with we're going to be with the People Summit? How can we promote the idea of just transition in transportation? And do you have proposal like 2, 3, or 4 proposal that indigenous people agree and already agree, a paper, something, a draft, and that we don't want negotiator to sign it, but we want minister to sign it, because minister of transportation. And so how can this be possible? We have the contact of People Summit, Beatrice, the young lady from Brazil. So that's my first question. How can we make it very, very practical, very efficient, that we cannot have on the global discussion an agreement for just an ethical transition on transportation, but we can discuss it and make them sign on NDC. They sign, the Minister of Transportation in the NDC can sign some point. You can have 2 or 3, 4 or 10, I don't know, proposition that you want them to sign to go towards zero emission shipping transportation or low shipping transportation. And my second question is an amazing news. I think it's not like a gold mine. some people of Fiji, the young people, they put a case in the International Court of Justice,
Oh, yeah.
and then they won. They It's like now, if you don't respect 1.5 Paris Agreement, then you are recognized as a criminal. No, like genocide. Or nobody know really the consequences of this enormous victory. But can you tell us a bit more about this victory at the International Court of Justice, and what is the consequences for the small island and for yeah.
Yeah, now we're going to that.
Okay. So in terms of the
Thank you, David.
thank you very much for the question. I think in terms of the just and equitable transition, I think maybe I'll just begin with like we actually didn't mention this in our talk, but like the beginnings of a just and equitable transition, where that notion came from. So in the beginning, I think the Pacific was only arguing for an equitable transition, because the just transition was already, quite well known at that time. And so, and also the climate justice as well, has to do with people. But there was a lobby at the IMO for the just transition because, I mean, and rightly so, because of the seafarers.
Yeah.
Those who provide the services in the IMO. So the just transition was about them. And so the compromise from the Pacific was to bring the needs of the most vulnerable and add it to the people who actually work and deliver international shipping, and to make sure that they're taken together in tandem. And that's why they appear as just and equitable in the IMO strategy. But of course, for the Pacific, from climate vulnerable and heavily reliant on shipping position, the equity part was always the most important for us, because that's what we need to address. Actually, the seafarers will always be the first that will be on the minds of the international shipping, of the International Maritime Organization. But the vulnerable have historically not been, and so that's why our main call was for that equity. And I think it's interesting what you mentioned about a possible ministerial declaration. I think together with the getting the political, because that's what it is. It's the political will that's required to get those concrete actions. And the thing is that we've talked about how what we agreed in October April may not be delivering on that transition. But as you say, countries and groups of countries can do things that are more ambitious than that. And the private sector can always be more ambitious than the targets we set for them. Those are still possible. And I think this idea probably of getting that and having that, those actions. I mean, we do have an initiative in the Pacific that has ministerial approval at that level. It's called the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership. And so that builds on that idea for Holomui more, where we need vessels and appropriate technology for our region. And that alliance also mirrors the alliance we have operating at the GSG negotiations to drive the just and equitable transition side. But at the regional sense, we have the initiative for the PBSP within the Pacific, working to actually, bring the political support and the ministerial support for all that work.
Tim, you talked about the ministerial support too, because for us as investors, we are, to making sure that we come fully prepared. We also think we're one of the only regions that actually we bring our transport ministers to these meetings as well, and they deliver interventions. And so, getting that political support as well at the IMO, but also in PBSP in the region as well helps.
It's the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership.
Yeah.
PBSP,
I'll put it on the chat. Yeah.
And actually, this might be something that we want them to put on the later release, I think it was. It's a very important initiative, and it's one of the first of its kind in the world. And it's something that the Pacific ministers are willing to champion as an example that many other regions can implement. But we're trying it in the Pacific first with the PBSP. And one of the examples, or the poster child of that, is the Jura Ice ship, which we talked about. So similar vessels like that for our regional transport and our national transport. Those are the things we need, and that's what also part of our equitable transition that we need in our region. Those energy efficient ships, and then ships that emit no emissions. And coming with that is the training and the crewing for the region and getting the technical support. But it all is we're starting it within this framework of PBSP, which will operate alongside what's happening at the IMO, but really at its own pace.
And speaking of, bro, the successes about, you know, being these examples, and you mentioned it, David, and, you know, we wanted to bring this in as well, was the ICJ advisory opinion. I was there at that advisory hearing, and that whole movement began by a group of students from the University of the South Pacific in Vanuatu. And so they were tired of, you know, internationally being ignored and all of these frustrations. So they wanted to form their own case and take it all the way to the International Court of Justice. And like you said, bro, it was one of the biggest successes because this was a Pacific student-led movement that took years in the making to reach all the way up. And that was, I think, one of the successes for our Pacific students, was getting that whole movement and the support from all. And so for us in the shipping, we look at, you know, success examples like that, and we say, okay, there is still hope that we can also bring that into the IMO negotiations.
Well, and I think the most important thing as well is that the ICJAO strengthens the arguments we've been making all this time, that all countries have obligations to address climate change. And also in the environmental treaties that they're party to. And I think what's also interesting is that the International Court of Justice actually referenced the International Maritime Organization as one of those organizations that have actually recognized the need to tackle climate change. And whether or not it's an actual step towards right true action and real action towards addressing climate change, it still remains to be seen. But it doesn't stop us in our region from pursuing ambitious work towards decarbonizing our own shipping. And I see that Pete has actually said there, and he's right, we haven't actually used ministerial statements, not like the Lautaro Declaration at this point, but and as I said, it's a very interesting, I think, consider it further.
True, thanks, Brother Pete. Oh, Philip, yes. Yes.
In the Hague?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, he brought it. Oh, wait, sorry.
In
with ICJ.
Yeah, ICJ, yeah. Oh, that's so cool. Small world. Yeah, I mean, in order for us, you know, I mean, this Talanoa is, I think, one of what we wanted to achieve. Yes, Philip, you wanted to say something? Sorry.
Oh. No.
Okay, we'll come back. But I mean, you know, for us coming into this space and meeting with you all and sharing our story, and, you know, the story is continuously evolving, was one of the things that we wanted to achieve, and we did, because in a way we're keeping this conversation going about international maritime shipping, and, you know, being in spaces like this, but in all the spaces that we, you know, that we go into and talk about the story, I think is really key. And again, thank you, Eleanor and Flotilla for Change, for having us come and just share a bit of the story, the technical, the artistic, the spiritual, everything all woven together in one mat. So thank you very much. And we will definitely be happy to share our contact details with Eleanor if you need to email us with any other questions that you may have. To connect us, our contact is with Eleanor, so you can also reach out to her and the Flotilla for Change team. But that will conclude for now this Talanoa between all of us, and hopefully we get to cross paths again in the future and get to share more and talk more story. So I'm very grateful to you all. And in a way, to end our Talanoa in Oceania, we usually give a thank you speech, but I will recite a chant of thanksgiving to each and every one of you for being here with us today, but also for my brother JK and our MCST team for continuously having us share the story. And this will just to end us off. And again, thank you all. Osmaprot. Os me tēne whaunga ngatu tua tako e ta ang. Hanua molo. Usete la tuk se fo la meur kalong. Ya, more, 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 more. Thank you. Thank you all for Yaxia.